For the last few months, a battle has raged over the airwaves of this show, as some of the period's most respected and decorated soldiers have vied for the accolade of Napoleon's greatest marshal. Those who have followed the reports on the Napoleonic Wars Pod Patreon feed will know that over the course of this titanic clash, heavyweights have fallen and dark horses have risen in the contest for the slots in the semi-finals. But now, the final places are up for grabs, as the last heat is upon us. Tonight, it's the turn of the much maligned marshals, Oudinot dismissed by Napoleon as dim, Grouchy, the great scapegoat of the Waterloo campaign, Marmont, who literally became a verb to betray in the French vernacular, and Poniatowski, often dismissed as a political appointee, and the three-day marshal, all lock horns for the honour of winning the final heat. The opening salvo of the Battle of the Marshals concludes right here, up next, on the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Hello and welcome back to the final heat in the Battle of the Marshals. Tonight, Oudinot, Poniatowski, Grouchy and Marmont. You might call this the heat of the dark horses of the competition, because none of these names are individuals who you would immediately associate as people who would make it through to the middle tier, the second round. But that might have been very deliberate manipulation of the heats by me. I will neither confirm nor deny that, but I am the puppet master here, which implies that I'm in control, and I'm really not in control, as you'll have established if you'd listened to the previous 4 installments. Because we're going to refuse to break with tradition, we will continue with this. I nearly called it this Russian roulette, this marshal roulette. Perhaps some of you are wishing that it was Russian roulette that was being played when it came to this. Who is your favorite / least favorite marshal? And we left you with a teaser of, was my least favorite marshal actually who you would all assume was my least favorite marshal? So we're gonna find out if it really is that simple, which is challenging because I'm still deciding who my least favorite marshal is, and I probably shouldn't admit that before embarking on the game. I am joined once again by Sam Jolly, curator of the Royal Logistic Corps Museum, Worthy Down, Winchester, and Josh Proven, master of the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel and author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira and Every Hazard and Fatigue, available from hellion.co.uk. Welcome back, folks, for the final installment, well, I say it's the final countdown. It's not the final countdown because you've got to come and judge the balloon debate. I might not have told you about that from the look on Sam's face, but nonetheless, you're coming back. You don't get a choice in it. So look forward to that. Yay. I'll be in touch. I promise I won't do it New Year's Eve, probably. Yes, so how does this game work at this stage? I get asked a question by each of the other individuals in the room. I'm telling you this so that you can play this at Christmas because you need to. And if you haven't played it at Christmas, you need to play it at New Year. Otherwise, you're not truly a Napoleonicist. There you go. You know, if you need that affirmation in your life, you have to play this game. You have to inflict this on your family now. You get asked, or you ask the other individual, one question only. You can't allow 2 questions, but you can be underhand and clever about this. So listen back to the previous installments of this game for top pro tips on how to win, because it really does matter that much. They'll ask me some questions. Each person gets 2 guesses, and then we shall see what happens at the end. Who wants to go first on this one? Josh, do you want to ask the first question?
Right, the first question. Okay. Is your least favorite marshal, say, a particularly well-known one?
Yes. Oh, stop pretending to look surprised, Sam.
Are you jealous of his thighs and buttocks?
Maybe.
It's Murat.
It is Murat, but come on, people! It wasn't even a the number of times I bashed Murat on this show. I did have another look at the list of marshals and tried to work. I mean, there are some people who I kind of go, yeah, I don't really know much about you, so you're not kind of up there in terms of my rankings. But there's plenty about Murat that I actively dislike, plenty I admire, as you will have heard from the last episode. And there's a certain irony there that in terms of greatness, I put him second to Bernadotte in that heat. Spoiler if you haven't gone and listened to the
Not
other.
that you had much choice.
Yes, but shush, shush, never mind. I did it of my own accord anyway, and I'm going to use that as kudos to prove the fact that I am fair and not judgmental. But yeah, I'm just not a fan of people who are overly ostentatious and look better than me in breeches. What can I say? There you go. I've admitted my jealousies. But there are
Chosen someone who, what I love the most is you've chosen someone who is the least likely to give a flying fuck that you don't like
this,
them.
this is absolutely true. And let's be honest, in a fight between me and Murat, I'm betting on Murat. So there you go.
Even just with his riding crop.
This is true. This is
I
true.
mean, you were saying earlier about it was one of the earlier heats. We're talking about which of the marshals could physically take the other marshals in a fight, and you're right. Mira was kind of a big guy. He dressed like a peacock, but he was like this German-like French soldier trooper, and he and Ney would probably come out the best.
Too right. Too right. In fact, yes, in a fight between all of the marshals, Murat is the one who comes out on top, but he's going to have blood on his ostrich feather, which is the one thing that he
You
will
just
actually care about.
you
Um,
disappear in a swirl of braid and feathers. Ha!
this is true. This is true. But there is less ostentation in this episode as we look at Oudinot, Poniatowski, Grouchy, and Marmont. We're going to dive straight into business. Joe Ayres, all of these pictures have been done by fans of the show. Joe Ayres is the one who picked up Oudinot, the Undying.
Nicholas Oudinot is typically excluded from the discussion of Best Marshal. He was not included in the initial creation of marshals, so his tenure was shorter than most of his peers. His opportunities at independent command resulted in defeat, earning him some stinging, if not entirely fair rebukes from Napoleon. And his famous tendency to acquire battlefield wounds necessitated periods of convalescence that kept him out of action and arguably denied him further opportunity for distinction. However, Oudinot served in nearly every campaign of the Napoleonic era, and he did so with significant distinction. He was entirely at home on the battlefield and utterly fearless in combat, from sabering Austrian gunners at their pieces and capturing an enemy cannon alone at Monzembano, to holding the line at Friedland against numerically superior Russians, to crossing the Berezina under desperate conditions. Oudinot was everywhere, and in the words of Napoleon himself after Friedland, everywhere he was feared. I think when discussing who the best marshal is, the specific events of a marshal's career are important not simply because of the importance of those events, but because they allow us to see the qualities of the man in question. These qualities determine how the individual arrived at the decisions they did and drove them to take the actions that they took. So, what of these events? Any of the marshals worth discussing for the title of best have careers fairly littered with exploits of great bravery and greater significance, and Oudinot's is no exception. The victory at Monzembano, wherein he earned the honor of keeping that cannon he captured, a highly unusual distinction which he alone among the marshal can claim, led to the Austrian withdrawal from the War of the Second Coalition and thus contributed to the close of that war. Friedland was decisive in bringing about the treaties of Tilsit and the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition. The significance of Berezina, however, is perhaps the most dramatic. Oudinot's tenacious defense of the building of the bridges at Studianka and even more ferocious defense of the bridgehead once across was singularly instrumental in saving the remnants of the Grande Armée from annihilation. Ensuring the survival of the army that day not only saved thousands of lives itself of great enough significance, but also enabled the veterans of the army to return to France and form the core of Napoleon's rebuilt army for the War of the Sixth Coalition. Berezina yields another moment in Oudinot's life worth noting for our purposes. Having been seriously wounded in the abdomen at the battle and evacuating to Vilna, he and a small band of soldiers found themselves surrounded by Cossacks with cannon in the cottage in which they were taking refuge. Oudinot, having just endured excruciating but unsuccessful surgical intervention to remove the musket ball in his abdomen, nevertheless refused to surrender and insisted on participating in the defense of the cottage himself. He asked for his pistols and his Grand Cordon of the Legion of Honor, defiantly saying, "If they take me alive, they will at least know who I am." He then proceeded to fire at Cossacks through the windows, his courage inspiring the men with him to put up a tenacious defense and allowing them to hold out until rescued by French cavalry. Oudinot distinguished himself in a more civil capacity as well, albeit as a military governor. Shortly after his creation as marshal, he was dispatched to invade and occupy Holland in order to enforce compliance with the continental system and otherwise bring Holland into the French corpus. It is in this episode that Oudinot, in my view, displays many of the qualities which truly distinguish him from his peers. In contrast to his fiery and obstinate personality as a commander, he proved himself to be mild, fair, and compassionate in control of occupied territory. His sympathetic treatment of the people of Holland caused Napoleon to frequently encourage Oudinot to take harsher measures against the populace, a practice Oudinot generally resisted. He was incorruptible, refusing to take bribes and forbidding his troops from looting and punishing harshly anyone who did. In achieving this peaceful occupation of Holland, I would submit that Oudinot spared Napoleon the headache of a Dutch version of this Peninsular War. By the time Oudinot left Holland in January 1811, he had earned the respect and admiration of the people of Holland, as well as that of a few of the crowned heads of Europe. Most notably, Alexander of Russia granted Oudinot's estates his personal protection when the Allies overran Oudinot's hometown of Bar-le-Duc in 1814. Such was the esteem in which he held Oudinot. So then, with the selection of the exploits of Oudinot and the significance thereof thus enumerated, what qualities are we meant to perceive in this man which so elevate him above his peers? First and foremost, he was a man of extraordinary courage, both physical and moral. His wounds attest to his willingness to throw himself into the line of fire repeatedly with no regard for his own safety. His abhorrence of looting and rigorous intolerance of it from his own officers and men speak quite clearly to Oudinot's moral courage. In fact, this total lack of rapaciousness sets him rather apart from many of his esteemed colleagues, even and especially his mentor and frequent contender for best marshal, Massena. He was possessed of a sense of duty that is difficult to overstate. Frequently, Oudinot would return to service soon after an injury, often much sooner than medical wisdom would otherwise have it. Such were the conditions of his service at Austerlitz, when Napoleon handed command of Oudinot's grenadiers to Duroc. Even then, Oudinot would not be denied and went to Duroc asking to serve under him, ultimately sharing command with him in the battle. When in Holland, his first wife died. Napoleon denied Oudinot's request for leave to bury his wife and see his grieving children. Incredibly, Oudinot abided by his emperor's wishes and continued to do his duty in Holland for another 7 months. Oudinot's sense of duty extended to his family as well. He understood that because his duty to the army kept him away from home for extended periods of time, his children needed a mother who could take care of them as they needed. It was thus that he married his second wife, with whom he enjoyed a marriage as happy and harmonious as his first. He was a dutiful husband, taking no mistresses during either marriage, in sharp contrast to the promiscuity which was such a defining characteristic of the marshalate. Oudinot was, finally, a man of the utmost uprightness and a strong sense of honor. His word was his bond. When it was clear that victory against the invading allies was impossible, he was among the marshals who insisted that Napoleon, the man to whom he and the rest of the marshals owed everything, abdicate. When pressed later by Napoleon about his thoughts on the issue of abdication, Oudinot was direct and irresolute. "I have served for 22 years. Over 30 scars permit me to say that I do not spare myself in battle. Well, I do not intend to draw my sword to encourage civil war." When he gave his allegiance to the restored Bourbons, he kept it, refusing to rally to Napoleon's side in the 100 Days, and retiring from public life in that period, famously stating that he would serve no one since he would not serve Napoleon. Most of the marshals have incredible careers, full of dashing exploits, incredible heroism, and near-suicidal bravery. Despite this, not all of them were worthy of the tremendous responsibility, authority, and prestige of their office. Oudinot was both a worthy commander and a thoroughly worthy man. His skill on the battlefield and courage under fire is indisputable. His sense of fairness and incorruptible nature were utterly becoming of a man wielding the baton of marshal of the empire. And his honor and fidelity to his word, especially in the turbulent times from Napoleon's first abdication to his final exile, reflect that his loyalty was always to the best interests of France. My choice for best marshal can only be the incomparable Duc de Reggio, Count of the Empire, Marshal Nicholas Oudinot, the Undying.
Joe Ayres there making the case for Oudinot, the undying marshal. And boy, does the guy pick up wounds. It's like he's a bullet magnet, quite frankly. Many moments of valor was the point that was made. And yes, he does. Keeping the cannon that he captured, I liked that one. A unique distinction, something to really mark Oudinot out as different. But then some of the others wouldn't have really cared about that. Would Berthier have been fussed about keeping a cannon? Not particularly, because Berthier would probably have been more concerned with how can I get this cannon to the front line by yesterday. That was sort of his jam. The Berezina case is important. We've talked about Murat kind of saving Napoleon's arse on occasions. Well, I mean, in terms of moments to be counted, yes, making sure that the crossing of the Berezina can actually happen is absolutely integral to the survival of and the continuation of the war. So, in some respects, should we wish that Oudinot hadn't have been so successful and therefore the war had been over? Because actually then you might have seen a preservation of the Bonapartist empire. There's a thought that must cause Sam much angst and sleepless nights. I also like the case regarding Holland on this one. There's a sort of Suchet element to this, getting it right in terms of making the right judgment calls. Not quite a Bernadotte there, but still kind of not really having the opportunity to go full Bernadotte, if I think we're being entirely fair, but nonetheless showing huge potential. So that ranks quite highly. We were talking about, dark horses. I do think Oudinot might be a dark horse in this competition in terms of raw skill, but I think he's perhaps one of these people that is not known enough for people to give him the credit that he deserves. Clearly very brave. So that's my assessment. And I'm getting lots of nods around the room, which is ever so slightly disconcerting me because I'm used to sort of boos and hisses and Sam sort of throwing things at the screen. Sam, you seem to be in agreement with what I'm saying here.
Yes, I was very pleasantly surprised by the Oudinot pitch because Oudinot is another one of those ones that I never really gave too much time of day to. And exactly as you say, the lack of a Dutch uprising, it's one of those what if things, but the fact that he got it right does count. If we're counting negatives like the peninsular failures to some of the other marshals, then we should definitely be counting when they prevented things from happening, when they got it right. I must admit, I did look up a painting of him, and he's not a very attractive looking man.
Oh, come on. Come on.
I know
Surely you like a grizzled veteran with a few scars to kind of add to his character.
He looks like an owl.
Yeah, the one I looked at, he had a massive forehead. I really feel sorry for his
Excuse me,
poor mother.
Davout had a 9 head, never mind a 4 head.
And I'm not saying this stands in the way of him its place in the competition. That's just a very unfair, judgmental comment from me. I found it really, really mean of Napoleon, and I know it's going to shock you that I think something Napoleon did was mean, that he didn't let Oudinot go home when his wife died.
What can I tell you? Sometimes this guy called Napoleon wasn't always the nicest individual known to humanity, Sam. I hate to burst your bubble there, but,
I also find it interesting that Oudinot went, oh, okay then, whereas I feel like if that had been Murat, he'd have gone, no, and had just ridden home.
He would have told Napoleon to foxtrot Oscar.
Exactly. But then
to be honest,
sometimes
Murat wouldn't have ridden home for Caroline Bonaparte. It just wouldn't have happened. And frankly, who could blame him?
he might have ridden home if his favorite horse was dying. Maybe he'd have done that.
That's more likely. Absolutely.
But for other marshals, we've taken the fact that they turned around to Napoleon and told him an honest truth as a positive. And so therefore, I feel with Oudinot that actually the fact that he didn't turn around and say, Napoleon, you're being outrageous. My wife has died. I need to go bury her, and my children are all alone. I actually see that as a tick against him. And it was the the argument there was that he had integrity and he was following orders, and that he had a very, very strong moral courage. And I completely get that as the basis of the argument in that pitch. That is definitely one side of it. To me, I feel like it's a little bit more of a tick against him. But other than that, I do think that that Oudinot was actually quite a dark horse, strong contender there. And the fact that he gets injured so often, and yet we don't see him as one of the brash in the front line heroes when he's getting injured in the front line huge amounts.
So what you're saying is that you would like Oudinot more if he was less loyal to your hero.
Yes, because I am a complex woman who's inconsistent, just like Napoleon was. He was a complex woman who was inconsistent.
Okay, there you go. There's the revelation that you weren't expecting in
evidence.
this podcast. And if you're sitting there thinking Sam can't be right, then all I will put to you is the Ridley Scott defense. Were you there? No. Well then. Josh, what about you and Oudinot? Do you find the Oudinot to be a complex woman like Napoleon?
Oudinot is a simple soldier. And that's his deal. And it was a good pitch, very persuasive. I think it's going to do quite well in this heat in Oudinot's favor. He doesn't have the responsibility given to him that other marshals get. He's another one of these guys that Napoleon likes to keep close. One of those guys he needs to keep around him for when he fights his battles. I need these guys to be able to do stuff, very stolid. But good administrators, it turns out. Sometimes the simple soldier types are the best ones to run civic authority, because they just sort of go by the book and don't annoy too many people. And he certainly did better in Holland than Napoleon's brother did. So that's a plus. Overall, I had a feeling, to be honest, that Oudinot would actually come in quite high, even if he perhaps doesn't sort of encapsulate the idea of the greatness of the marshalate. But in a sort of a way, he does, in just his inability to die, and the invincibleness of the Grande Armée is sort of like it dies hard, like Oudinot dies hard, sort of thing. So he's very much in the spirit of the Grande Armée.
Oudinot is the embodiment of the Grande Armée, loyal to Napoleon to a fault, to the detriment of his own health, and possibly mental well-being, and wizened and full of battle scars, which Sam seems and looks like an owl, which apparently
he does look like an owl,
which apparently is a problem for Sam. Okay, so there's a lot of love in the room for Oudinot, and again, thank you to all of the contributors, but a really thought-provoking pitch there, and a really well-aimed pitch, I think it's fair to say, from Joe, to make the case for somebody who isn't perhaps as widely exalted, but nonetheless has drawn a lot of praise from us. Next up is probably a more famous individual, but a rather unique one. David Graylick makes the case for Poniatowski.
Hello, my name is David Graylick, and I have the honor of presenting the figure of Prince Józef Poniatowski in our Marshals contest. At the beginning, I'd like to point out that comparing Prince Poniatowski to the other Marshals is a bit difficult, as he is the only foreigner in this list. But the question is if it proves to Prince Józef's disadvantage. In my opinion, no, and in fact it's quite the opposite. Poniatowski's life is a story of transformation from a young man, a member of the royal family who rode naked through the streets of Warsaw, to a real statesman and national hero. In general, the story of Poniatowski is part of the difficult history of Poland at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, marked by successive partitions and the struggle to regain independence. Initially, there was little indication that Prince Józef would become a figure that we know. Following in his father's footsteps, he entered into service in the Austrian army. After being summoned to the country by his uncle, King of Poland Stanisław August, in the age of 26 he became a general. In the late 1780s and early 1790s, he led a lavish social life, and the race story also comes from this period. Nevertheless, Poniatowski took his responsibilities seriously. At the age of 29, so in the age at which Napoleon went to Egypt, Prince Józef became commander-in-chief of the main Polish army that fought against the Russians during the War of 1792 and won the Battle of Zieleńce, which was the first major Polish victory in over 100 years. After the Third Partition of Poland in 1795, Prince Józef remained out of military service, leading a social life rich in anecdotes. The situation changed in 1806 with the entry of the Grand Armée into Polish lands. Despite hesitation, he decided to support the French. As one of his biographers, Szymon Askanazy, wrote, Poniatowski knew that he was probably facing his last chance to play a significant role in history, as well as to redeem his own and his family's name. With the support of Talleyrand and Murat, Poniatowski became Director of War in the Polish government formed in January 1807 and commander of one of the Polish divisions/legions. By the way, he remained on good terms with Murat for the rest of his life, which may not be surprising in view of their shared personal courage and love for fancy outfits. The task facing the prince was not easy. The army had to be organized during conditions of notorious shortages and conflict with generals Dąbrowski and Zajączek. Despite many attempts to dismiss him, Poniatowski managed to retain his position. After the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw, he became Minister of War and in the autumn of 1808 also Commander-in-Chief of the Duchy's army. Poniatowski led to the unification of the Polish army, initially divided into 3 autonomous legions, and surrounded himself with many talented subordinates, such as General Stanisław Fischer, who could be boldly called the Polish Berthier. Another argument in his favor is the cause of the war against Austria in 1809. Despite the Austrian advantage, Poniatowski was victorious in the war. During the biggest battle, the Battle of Raschen, Poniatowski personally led one of the counterattacks on foot. Between 1809 and 1812, Poniatowski carried out further work for the army. As Minister of War, he didn't draw a salary for several years, devoting it entirely to the army and military schools. Thanks to this, as well as his attention to treating soldiers as fellow citizens, Poniatowski became popular among soldiers. Prince Józef also had to face strong opposition within the duchy, which wanted to limit military spendings. It's also worth noting that he didn't only follow orders from the French, as would be expected of a member of the government of a French-dependent state, but showed initiative in presenting successive reform projects and trying to raise funds. Despite being tempted by the Russians in 1811, he chose to remain on Napoleon's side. During the Russian campaign, Prince Józef commanded the 5th Corps of the Grand Armée. After the unsuccessful first phase of the campaign, marked by significant losses, Poniatowski embarked on arguably the best period of his military career. At the Battle of Chirikovo, September 29th, he defeated 3 times larger Russian forces, and during the Battle of Tarotino, he contributed significantly to saving Murat's troops. After the defeat in Russia, he prevented the Duchy of Warsaw from going over to the Russian side, despite the measures taken by members of the government. In the spring of 1813, as in 1809, in the face of a crisis in the civilian government, it was Poniatowski who became the most important person in the state. He led his troops into Saxony and successfully commanded his forces during the autumn campaign of 1813. Appointed marshal during the Battle of Leipzig, he effectively commanded his corps. On the last day of the battle, he covered the retreat of the Napoleonic forces and, in the view of the premature blowing up of the bridge on Elster, had to break through and died while crossing the river. It's worth mentioning that at this point, in the few days before his death, Poniatowski received a stab wound and 3 gunshots, and these weren't the only bad wounds that Poniatowski had during his life. If Marshal Oudinot is famous of the number of his wounds, Poniatowski also deserves a mention, as he commanded his men to the end despite the considerable suffering he had to endure with no doubt. Through his heroic death as well as his achievements, Poniatowski became an important figure in Polish history, unfortunately now a little bit forgotten. To sum up, Prince Poniatowski was active in many fields during his career, as commander, organizer, and even politician. At a relatively young age, he was given command of the main Polish army in a situation when most marshals were just beginning their careers. Fact, this was connected with his social background, but in practice he proved to be a good commander who was aware of his limitations. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was a commander-in-chief of the army of one of the countries of the Napoleonic system. It was in a difficult situation in which non-Napoleonic marshals had been. Criticized by politicians and even part of his own officer corps, he was able to build an effective army and successfully led it. In the moments of crisis in 1809 and 1813, it was he, not the sovereign or politicians, who was the most important person in the state. Against this background, he definitely stood out from commanders from other countries of the Napoleonic system, as well as from most of the marshals. By this attitude, regardless of Napoleon's actual motivations, he fully deserved his marshal's baton. And although he was marshal for only 3 days, he fully deserves to be placed among Napoleon's finest marshals. His large life, significant achievements, and importance to the history of the Napoleonic Wars are certainly factors in this.
David Graylick there making the case for Poniatowski, the 3-day marshal. And Josh is going to go on a rant about that element in due course. This is a tough one to judge, right? Because really what you have to do is judge Poniatowski as a general, and I think perhaps as a figure in Polish history, which I'm not steeped in, I will freely admit. More than anything else. And that's a particular challenge in a competition where, frankly, we're looking at a bunch of French guys with long military service and lots of questions about loyalty or otherwise to Napoleon. Poniatowski was loyal. The cynic in me questions the degree to which that was down to the cause of Polish nationalism kind of being tied up in the success of the Bonapartist Empire, in that if Napoleon's redrawing the map of Europe and you've been loyal to Napoleon as a Pole, then you're going to have somewhere to go in Polish society. And let's be honest, the Poles get an absolutely horrendous deal throughout the course of history, full stop, never mind the history of this period. Unusual, unique, I think it's fair to say, in being the only non-French marshal, which is significant in its own right. That says something about this guy's skill in relation to the other generals, that it's Poniatowski who gets elevated. Highly capable, without question. Is there brilliance? I think that's very open to interpretation. I think if you're searching for brilliance, you've got to look more at Poniatowski's fighting record against the Austrians than anything else. I mean, look, he's significant as a heroic and important figure in Polish history. But even then, I have to ask, does he change the fate of his country compared to somebody like Bernadotte, who does change the fate of his country? So again, if we're going to be kind of common in terms of the yardsticks that we're using, I'm just not sure that Poniatowski edges out some of the others on any particular front. And that's, I think, the challenge that I have with Poniatowski. Fully understand that if we were doing significant figures in Polish history, Poniatowski would quite obviously rank highly during this period. But you would also want Marie Walewska right up there in that conversation. So yeah, that's where I'm at with this one. A bit ambivalent. Josh, I'm going to let you have your 3-day marshal rant at this stage.
Well, the problem with Poniatowski is indeed that if you're judging the marshals on their careers, as I said in a previous episode, you're already facing some trouble with the ones who were made marshal in 1812, let alone guys who were made marshals and then were immediately killed. Not his fault, but it makes it difficult, given that the criteria for judging the greatness of the other ones is obviously going to be quite different for Poniatowski. He was a capable general. He gave Napoleon some very good advice in 1812, which Napoleon ignored. The Poles were instrumental in the 1812 invasion of Russia. Without them, it couldn't have happened at all. And he was ostensibly in charge of the majority of the Polish forces in that campaign. The problem is that he is something of a novelty. And there's no doubt in my mind that Napoleon made marshals for several criteria, like to fulfill several criteria. One, very like good generals. What the other ones are Oudinot, and some of them are useful to be made a marshal. And Poniatowski is one of the ones that he decided would be useful to make a marshal. The timing was not brilliant. He probably should have made him a marshal earlier in order to try and beef up his Polish position. And unfortunately, I have a feeling his elevation of Poniatowski to the marshalate is sort of indicative of his cynicism towards the Polish state in itself. That he was quite willing to sell down the river to Alexander I, and so it was looking useful to him to have a Polish marshal, and Poniatowski was the only one he could make a marshal. And so I don't think he made him one of the group, one of the club, for reasons of he either made him a marshal because he thought he owed it to him for his loyal service, or because it was politically useful at the time to encourage his Polish troops and how much he valued them. And unfortunately, because and this has nothing really to do with his standing as a soldier, as a man, but unfortunately, you just can't really grade him because he was killed 3 days after he was made a marshal. So we don't know what his career as a marshal would have been like. And unfortunately, just makes it such a weird. It's a good pitch, valiant pitch, because of all these problems. But he is a marshal, but there's nothing to grade him against the others with, because if you were doing Napoleon's greatest generals, you could. But unfortunately, he's the 3-day marshal for a reason.
I imagine some people will be booing and hissing into their Christmas dinner, because you're obviously listening to this whilst, I mean, to be honest, I'm not even sure this is going out on Christmas Day. But if it is, I'm sure people are listening to this at the Christmas dinner table and booing and hissing into their turkey at you, Josh. Other options of foodstuffs on Christmas Day are, of course, available.
I sympathize with them, because it's a nitpicky thing to say, because he does qualify, but at the same time he doesn't qualify, and that makes him a great pain to judge.
I thought you were going to start commenting on Christmas dinner options there. I was genuinely
don't waste
worried.
food. Don't waste food, you monsters.
I was genuinely slightly worried where you were going with that. Yeah, it is a problem with Poniatowski, isn't it? Because he is arguably more general than marshal. Sam, are you going to sort of turn around and tell us that we're both wrong on this?
Yes and no, which is obviously a really bad response. Because on the one hand, with people like my beloved Lan and people like Jourdan, we have put a lot of emphasis on their Revolutionary War efforts. So why can't we do that for I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. Hold on, I am Poniatowski. Have I done that right?
Poniatowski.
Poniatowski. There we go. The first time I've ever tried to say that out loud. So we should be doing that for Poniatowski as well. It is then complicated by the fact that he's only a marshal for 3 days, and I feel like maybe my argument there might be stronger if he'd been a marshal for 2 years and had 20 years worth of military experience before that to be judging. Perhaps it's the 3-day part that makes it the hardest bit. But otherwise, I I quite like him. He's another one that I had never really, to my shame, put any reading into before. But the fact that he has this legacy with the Polish army, and the fact that within Poland, straight after his death, that there was this sort of like minor cult following for him, I think definitely stands. It might not stand him to be greatest marshal, but it definitely doesn't put him anywhere near the bottom.
To my enduring shame, I have been in the building where Poniatowski is buried, and I wasn't a Napoleonic nerd at that moment in my life. And so I have probably walked past Poniatowski's grave without pausing to pay my respects. And believe me, that really gets on my nerves, to the point where I'm going to have to go back to Krakow to pay my respects at some point, because it needs to be done, quite frankly. Yeah, it's a difficult one to judge. As we say, we can completely understand his significance within the context of Polish history, but yeah, do you know what? I'm not even sure that he would win out in that particular contest, because I would personally make a stronger case for Marie Walewska, but that's a whole other conversation. Okay, so enough on Poniatowski. David, thank you for a very valiant pitch. David, a very avid supporter and friend of the show. Well, next up, the much maligned Marshal, somebody who has a soft spot in my heart because I pity them. Sam Moore has done a very valiant job in making the case for Grouchy.
Hello, dear friends. I'm Samuel Moore, and what a pleasure it is to be here on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Today I'm here to make the case for the French marshal that's been most poorly treated by history. I'm speaking, of course, of Emmanuel de Grouchy. Most people only know two things about Grouchy. They know he's the last marshal of France created by Napoleon, and they know he's often blamed for Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. My pitch to you today is simple. 1. There's much more to Grouchy than 1815. 2. Grouchy is the most intriguing what-if of the Napoleonic Marshalate. 3. The accusation about Waterloo is utterly unjustified. And 4. The aftermath of Waterloo highlights why Grouchy was a superb marshal. Let's dive right in. Context matters when it comes to Grouchy. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about his career prior to 1815. Grouchy was an aristocrat, but unlike many in his social caste, he supported the revolution and fought tenaciously in defence of its ideals. He was wounded no fewer than 14 times in his career and served with distinction on many occasions, particularly as a cavalry commander. It's worth noting that Grouchy achieved the rank of General of Division at the age of 28 in 1795. To put that in context, that's before Napoleon came to prominence. The point I'm trying to make is this. When Napoleon created his first batch of marshals in 1805, Grouchy was a prime candidate. He was just as qualified as many, and dare I say it, better qualified than some. It was likely his assumed connection with Moreau, rather than his ability, that meant he wasn't given the baton until 10 years later. Before I make my next point, I'd like to just talk about the Napoleonic Marshalate more generally. In many respects, Napoleon crafted the Marshalate to be a multifaceted military tool for his personal use. Each marshal had strengths and weaknesses, and this allowed Napoleon to employ them in different ways, depending on what job he needed doing and whose skills best suited it. I would argue that Grouchy filled a unique niche within this conceptual framework. Granted, he didn't have the flash and flair of men like Murat, the gun-ho nature of men like Ney, or the genius for independent command of men like Davout. But he more than made up for this with his dependability, his caution, and his willingness to follow his orders to the letter. Can you name me another marshal that exemplifies those qualities better than Grouchy? It's also worth noting that Grouchy was not of a quarrelsome temperament, in stark contrast, I might add, to many in the Marshalate whose squabbles and petty rivalries put whole campaigns in jeopardy. For this reason, I often think of Grouchy as the what-if marshal. How different might Spain, for instance, have been if Grouchy's caution and good sense been present amongst the marshals in the peninsula? Ultimately, we'll never know. But my point is this. Grouchy might not be the most colourful or exciting of the marshals, but he's exactly the sort of man you want leading armies. And had he been given his chance sooner, perhaps things may have been different for Napoleonic France. This leads me to the elephant in the room, 1815. For reasons of brevity, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of the whole Waterloo campaign, but I would like to make 4 points. 1. The many failures within the French army during this campaign came from the top down. Napoleon must take the lion's share of the blame for Waterloo. 2. Napoleon never encouraged his marshals to improvise. Much like Wellington, he was an authoritarian commander. He issued his orders and expected them to be followed to the letter. That's exactly what Grouchy excelled at and exactly what he did at Waterloo. 3. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that Grouchy was a newly created marshal in 1815, and consequently his immediate subordinates, particularly Gerard and Vandamme, made his life unnecessarily difficult, largely because they were resentful of the fact that he'd been given a marshal's baton and they hadn't. 4. Let's put this old myth to rest. Let's say, hypothetically, that on the 18th of June, Grouchy had disobeyed his direct orders, gone against all grand strategic practice of the age, abandoned his independent mission, and marched to the sound of the guns. I'm laughing because the idea is ridiculous, but let's say he had done that. What would have been the outcome? Well, unless Grouchy could also teleport in this hypothetical scenario, he couldn't have got to Waterloo in time to have made any difference to the outcome of the battle. Grouchy wasn't responsible for what happened at Waterloo. And with all the things I've just mentioned in mind, it's therefore not reasonable to assess his capabilities as a marshal exclusively through the prism of the 17th and 18th of June 1815. But this rather leaves a question open, doesn't it? How then should we assess Grouchy as a marshal? How about this? The image of Grouchy I'd like to leave you with relates to the day after Waterloo, the 19th of June, arguably Grouchy's finest hour. What does he do when he discovers the extent of the disaster that's just engulfed Napoleon's army, leaving him horribly exposed, pitted against impossible odds, his career potentially in tatters, and having to face the very real prospect that soon he might be staring down the barrels of a firing squad if the Bourbons retake the throne? What does he do? I'll tell you what he does. He exemplifies all those fine qualities I talked about earlier and more. He keeps his cool. He calmly disengages from Wavre. He conducts a skillful yet speedy retreat back to France, gathering up some of the shattered remnants of Napoleon's defeated army along the way. He avoids being cut off and forced to surrender by the Prussians, and ultimately, he gets his men back to Paris in good order, in good time, before the Allies, ready to defend the capital and fight another day. Are you honestly telling me that any other marshal could have done better under those circumstances? To conclude, Grouchy, the unfairly scapegoated marshal, Grouchy, the what-if marshal, Grouchy, the clever, cautious, dependable marshal, Grouchy, the marshal that's been so poorly treated by history. Today you have the opportunity to rectify one of the great wrongs of the Napoleonic Wars. I warmly encourage you to take it. Vote for Emmanuel de Grouchy.
The case for Grouchy there, the much maligned marshal, as made by Sam Moore. I really enjoyed this pitch. I know that Sam spent a lot of time going through bits and bobs, and he wasn't quite sure whether or not he was gonna. I think he was a little bit intimidated when he heard that people like Ed Koss and Alex Mika were also going into this competition, and absolutely knocked that out of the park. It's worth saying that Sam is a musician, not a historian, and yet handled it like better, frankly, than some historians that I've come across. So kudos there, Sam. A really good pitch. It was always going to go down well with me, let's be honest. It's not as though I keep my views on Grouchy a secret. I do regard him as the great scapegoat of Waterloo. I often enter into arguments with people who think they understand what Grouchy should have done at Waterloo and get it catastrophically wrong. He fights a very valiant rearguard action, just as Sam has fought a very valiant rearguard action there to try and defend Grouchy's reputation. He does have that flaw that we've just talked about in that he's an 1815 marshal. So all he's got really is the Waterloo campaign. And obviously that's not an occasion where he gets covered in glory. He doesn't do much at Ligny. Fine. And then everybody blames him for what he does. Well, no, everybody blames him for doing what Napoleon told him to do in the first place. There we go. I've started off on that rant. I promise I'll now start to rein it in. But yeah, I like Grouchy as an individual. Not my favorite marshal. And I'm not sure. I don't think I can say he's the greatest marshal. I can't say that he's above a Ney. I can't say that he's above a Bernadotte. But he deserves far more credit than he ever gets. And I'm hugely grateful to Sam for making that case so emphatically and so eruditely. Sam, let me get your take on Grouchy. Are you one of these people who just screams, "Where is Grouchy?" into the ether, much to the bemusement of your colleagues in your museum?
No, not at all. I very much understand that Napoleon was not at his best at Waterloo. This is partly why I put very little study into Waterloo, because I don't want to have to hear about it. But I understand he was not his best at Waterloo, and it's pretty much his fault he lost. And poor Grouchy is just doing what he's told. So I completely and totally understand that. I really enjoyed Sam's ending there that made it sound like a political campaign. Vote for me. Nice little bit of flair there, and I have enjoyed the unique flares of some of the pictures. So that definitely goes in your favor there, Sam. That bumps it up a little bit.
Okey-doke. So points from Sam there, but Josh, we know your deep-seated ire for those individuals who weren't part of the original group of marshals. We know your prejudice on this. Does that prejudice also shine through when it comes to Grouchy?
In fairness, it has to an extent, because because as Sam pointed out, there is the case that we can talk about Poniatowski, for instance, through his earlier career, like we did for some of the other ones. And therefore, you can do the same with Grouchy. But the difference between Grouchy and Poniatowski is that Grouchy is with the Grande Armée for actually quite a considerable amount of time. He is a divisional commander of cavalry, a cavalry commander, generally speaking. He might have commanded a corps of cavalry at some point before this, actually. And so he's on Napoleon's radar already. And he's not someone who Napoleon, fatally in this case, really lets out of his sight very often. But all of that, nevertheless, goes into the problem that how do you compare, in terms of greatness, a man who was given the job with the Second Restoration, the beginning of the Second Restoration, he hands out a marshal's baton as to Grouchy, which is an interesting choice, but it's warranted. He's a good cavalry officer, and he does a creditable job as a marshal and a commander of two corps of a wing of the army. So it shows that it was a good choice. The problem is that the rest of the campaign had issues in itself, but we're not here to get into that. For the reasons that I have trouble sort of comparing Poniatowski's greatness as a marshal to the others, I have the same with Grouchy, although I do have sympathy with the problem with the Waterloo campaign, and I have on record on several podcasts saying that Grouchy is not to blame for Waterloo, and there's nothing he could have done unless he was magic, unless he was actually a wizard and could just transport troops anywhere he wanted. In which case, well, Napoleon really wouldn't have been necessary, would he? It's a good pitch. I don't know how it's going to win through against some of the others in terms of the greatness debate.
I think that's true if we consider others outside of this heat. Can we say that Grouchy eclipsed, for example, Murat? Pains me heavily to say this, but no, we cannot. And I'm deeply sorry, Grouchy. It's like I've just betrayed a sort of a nephew that I'm particularly fond of.
The other thing to remember as well is that a lot of the reason people want to sort of give time to Grouchy is because he was so hard done to. So you don't want to let that color you the opposite direction, because as a general with independent command, we only know a certain amount about him. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
That's true, but as a general with independent command, he does win at Wavre,
Yes.
which is the point that's always
at the end of the 1815 campaign, he's the only French general not to suffer defeat.
Indeed, which is important and significant in its own right. I guess where I'm kind of going with this is in terms of relativity against somebody like Poniatowski. Does that therefore give him an edge that actually here he has gone and proven that he can do it?
Mathematically, yes.
Josh is a harsh taskmaster in this round. He really is. Okay, so clearly I haven't convinced Mr. Proven on this one. I'm sorry, Grouchy. I tried to defend your honor. We will, however, move on to the final pitch of the heats. Dave Watson makes the case for the Raguser, Marshal Marmont.
Hi, my name is Dave Watson, and I am pitching for Marshal Auguste Marmont, Duke of Ragusa. For me, the Balkan Marshal is an obvious choice, but he is perhaps something of a challenge in this project. When most English-speaking Napoleonic buffs think of Marmont, they immediately think of Salamanca. That battle may not have been his finest moment, but I would ask you to look at his record more broadly. Marmont was born into an army family and entered the artillery. Here he met one Napoleon Bonaparte, serving together at Toulon. His early military service highlights included being Bonaparte's aide-de-camp in Egypt, winning distinction and promotion. He organised the artillery in subsequent Italian campaigns and even saved Bonaparte from capture, ironically, as we will see, by Croats at Arcola in 1796. He also commanded a corps at the Great Manoeuvre of Ulm in 1805. Now, the peace with Austria gave France new territories in Dalmatia, where I first came to appreciate Marmont in the research for my book on the Napoleonic Wars in the Adriatic. He took possession of much of Dalmatia with a small army despite a powerful Russian force. For the next 5 years, he was military and civil governor of Dalmatia, and traces of his rule still survive in public works and memory. He introduced the rule of law, prison reform, abolished torture and flogging, playing to Zach here. He created schools and colleges. Most South Slav historians agreed he ruled well, and streets were named after him until World War II. He was liked despite having to finance the costs of the French administration and fund war reparations. The Illyrian province's appointment was challenging, given the geography and the different religions and nationalities. His staff included interpreters speaking 7 different languages. Marmont learned Croatian and sponsored a dictionary. He also built effective diplomatic relations with the Bosnians and the Ottomans. Now, his Balkan campaigns may not be well understood in Britain, but they weren't a sideshow to Napoleon. Napoleon wrote to his brother Joseph, then King of Naples. He said, "Corfu is so important to me that its loss would deal a fatal blow to my plans. The Adriatic would be closed, and your kingdom would have on its left flank a port where the enemy could assemble to attack you. You must regard it as more valuable than Sicily. Mark my words, in the current situation in Europe, the worst misfortune that could happen to me is to lose Corfu." Militarily, Marmont performed brilliantly in Dalmatia, making what John Elting calls a remarkable 300-mile march through frequently roadless country, scattering 2 Austrian forces, but clinging to his independent status. He fought in challenging conditions with 2 successful incursions into Bosnia to defeat Ottoman forces and deter raiding. The Austrians struggled to do the same. In the 1809 campaign, he advanced from Dalmatia and defeated Gyulai's corps at the Battle of Graz before marching to support Napoleon at Vienna and in the Battle of Agram. After that, he got his marshal's baton, although his detractors point out that Napoleon said, "Between ourselves, you have not done enough to entirely justify my choice." That was, in my view, a bit ungrateful, although it may reflect the fact that Marmont had a detached command for most of the campaign. He delivered independently when others operated mainly under the Emperor's supervision. After Massena failed in Spain, Napoleon again turned to Marmont for another independent command. He outmaneuvered Wellington in the relief of Ciudad Rodrigo. Yes, he was defeated at Salamanca, but he was wounded early in the battle along with his deputy, and command went down to Clausel. After recovering from his wounds, he commanded a corps in the 1813 campaign. He fought throughout the great defensive campaign of 1814, fighting a skillful retreat. At this stage, he and others recognised the game was up, and he led negotiations with the Allies. He stuck to his oath to the Bourbons and didn't rejoin Napoleon at Waterloo. He held many posts during the Restoration and was Major General of the Guard on duty during the July 1830 Revolution. Although he disagreed with his orders to put down the revolution, he did his best but was overwhelmed. He died in Venice in 1852, the last living Napoleonic marshal. So why does Marmont not get the recognition I think he deserves? Well, in the English-speaking world, there is no biography. His memoirs were published in France after he died in 1857, and there is a long out-of-print 1968 French biography. In any case, we are obsessed by the Peninsular War and Waterloo in Britain, and Marmont excelled in less fashionable theatres of war. Bonapartists hated him because they claimed he betrayed Napoleon in 1814 and he didn't return to the fold in 1815. This showed, in my view, superior political judgment and honoured the oath he had just given to the Bourbons. In France, the verb Ragusa, derived from his title, the Duke of Ragusa, was a household word in France that meant to betray. The Royalists also disliked him because they claimed he did not put down the 1830 revolution. So, in conclusion, I would argue he was the most rounded of the marshals. To use a cricket analogy, he could bat at number 5 and still bowl the opposition out. Perhaps the most educated and cultured of the marshals, and one of the few to write a thesis on the art of war. A talented strategist, understanding the art of command and the movement of troops, his military, diplomatic, and administrative skills make him the premier Marshal of France.
The case for Marshal Marmont there, made by Dave Watson. Marmont can't survive the Ragusa issue, can he? You know, he has literally become a verb in the French language. That's how much he's hated and known for his betrayal. I do feel very conflicted when it comes to Marmont because I admire the man's integrity enormously. But it comes back to that question of where does he rank against the people that we know really properly proved themselves. He has a Wellington problem, but even if you put the Wellington problem to one side, and we'll come back to that in due course, he's still got a problem full stop, which is that I think even he's a little bit surprised that he gets the Marshal's baton when he does after Wagram, because for sure he'd been Napoleon's protege, was very close to Napoleon, which is part of the reason that I admire him turning around and going no, putting his foot down. But he doesn't shine before that point. Competent without question, decent as a governor. I believe it's out in Dalmatia, isn't it? I mean, he's Duke of Dalmatia. But I don't get signs of particular greatness pre-baton. And then, as we said with so many of them, he's got a Spain problem, which is more fundamentally a Wellington problem. And yes, he's a great maneuverer, without question. He outmaneuvers Wellington emphatically throughout, actually, much of the Salamanca campaign, catches Wellington on the hop, and then that parallel march between the two armies within sort of a mile of one another, literally within cannon range of one another at various points, is a hugely impressive feat on both sides. But any mistake from either one side at any one point could have, would have, and ultimately was fatal. And it wasn't a big mistake at Salamanca, but he's not an attacker. He has the opportunity to go toe-to-toe with Wellington on equal terms at San Cristobal and goes, no, I'm not going to attack Wellington on ground of his own choosing. And part of me goes, yes, but that's smart. And that's the right thing to do because all the others have tried it and all the others have got it wrong. But at the same time, you need balls and brains, right? And I'm not saying that Marmont lacked balls, and I'm not saying that he needs to be a Murat and just mass together the combined French cavalry and charge for Wellington centre. But there is that sort of that hesitancy that I think is lacking amongst the truly great commanders across history and certainly across the Marshals. He's not a Lannes, and that's my problem. He's not a Lannes, and I think he would need to be to win my vote for the truly greatest Marshal out of all of them. That's my problem with Marmont. He's got a Wellington problem, but he's not better than a number of the others who come up against Wellington. You know, he's not a Massena. I'm not even sure he's a Ney, actually. And it pains me to say this because I like Marmont as an individual, but it's not a contest of who is the person that I think I would most like to go for drinks with. It's who's actually the best amongst these people at doing their job. And I don't think it can be Marmont on that one. Sam?
Firstly, I like how in the past two pitches you've proven my point from the last episode, and you keep using Murat as the benchmark. He permeates this. He is the true Marshal legacy. It keeps coming back to him. I'm very undecided on Marmont. I do find it very hard because on the one hand, this pitch did a very, very, very good job at convincing me that he did really well in Dalmatia and that he didn't do too badly in the Peninsula. But it's just coloured by him being a traitor to me.
The
Traitor
biases come to the fore once again.
So it's really hard because if I try and push down that Bonapartist loyalism, and it hurts to push it down. If I try and push it down, the fact that he is quite a well-rounded Marshal and that he does quite well at these things is a massive tick. I'm not going to lie.
Okay, so Sam can't get over her prejudice against the people who see the light when it comes to Bonaparte. We've established that many times over the course of this series. Out of interest, if you could just remove the inverted commas betrayal from the picture, does he still rank against the greats? You know, he's not a Davout, he's not a Massena, he's not a Soult for me, and I think that's my problem.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate, to be honest. He's very good, but not necessarily the best.
Okay, Josh, would you agree?
Marmont is one of the guys that I ask people to take a second look at because all they ever remember is Salamanca, and indeed his surrender in 1814. He's actually kind of a little like Lannes in certain ways. He's a good friend of Napoleon, for a start. They know each other rather well. And I think Napoleon hoped that he might be another Lannes, another vanguard commander he could rely on to do stuff. But and you can kind of see him trying to prove himself when he goes to Spain and he pulls out every stop. He shows his worth as a general, and he he keeps Wellington guessing. And as you said, and as we've said on previous occasions, Salamanca ends when one of them blinks, one of them trips, and he tripped first. Simple as that. And Wellington took advantage of it. Simple as that. It's something that was unavoidable once it happened, and then he had the bad luck of being hit by a shell. So I think it's a good argument that not to discount him because of these problems, and indeed the biggest problem of the Ragusa. That is an open question. What could have been done? Was there a hope in fighting on? Or did he actually do the same thing and say no? He lived for a very long time. He like a little bit like Soult. I'm kind of disappointed there isn't a photograph of him. And he commanded a corps, actually, before he was a marshal in 1805. He was at Ulm. This guy is not somebody who, as popular perception sort of tells us, was made a marshal just because he was Napoleon's friend. I think Napoleon made that sort of joke about it in order to make him understand that if you don't perform, people are just going to think that I promoted you because you're my buddy. So do well. Unfortunately, a shell hit him, and that was kind of the end of that. But I do agree, however, that first of all, you're getting the problem of one of the later on marshals. You're getting a problem of one of a man who simply does not have the widespread appeal of the other marshals. Doesn't, even contemporarily speaking, major problems contemporarily speaking. And alas, his case for greatest marshal is indeed completely undone, and I don't buy into the whole treachery thing by the Ragusa bit, because that essentially cuts him off from Napoleon's greatest marshal, because Napoleon did not want him to make that call on his own. And so you have that problem. However, it's a very good pitch, and it does tell us not to just discount Marmont. He was a great marshal.
I would love to agree with you that he was a great marshal, and I'm just not entirely sure that I can. And
it's more that because
1813, 1814, he's not sure he's got to recover from his injury, but 1814, he's not doing anything electric. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. It's more the thing that I believe he's a great marshal, possibly because he had the potential to be. And he was in 1813-14, but it's sort of the issue with discounting him because he wasn't electric is because, again, he's under Napoleon's eye. And a lot of marshals were, but they had longer careers to show that they could do other things and shine. I mean, there's that wonderful moment, I think it's him, in 1813 or 14, when you have this problem with the Marie Louises. And he gets so frustrated with the fact that these troops are so badly trained, he gets off his horse and teaches them in the firing line. He actually loads a musket for one of the soldiers and says, "This is how you do this." let's get fighting. There's something to Marmont that we shouldn't discount, but in all honesty, is he the greatest marshal?
Well, that is the question before us. But before we can get to that point, we need to decide where these guys rank against one another. And it's very interesting that what we've done throughout this heat isn't really focused so much on where they rank against one another, so much as where they rank against the more famous heavyweights, which in some respects isn't really the task immediately before us, is it? But so we might be slightly surprised at where we come out on this. I've come to some musings on this. I think I'm happy with my ranking, but I'm not sure you guys will necessarily agree, particularly towards the bottom end. But let's see where you're going with this. Josh, take it away. What's your ranking?
With this one, I had to rely more on the pitches themselves and the cases themselves more than any of the other ones, because these are all marshals of a particular type. So my opinion on them matters even less because these guys are going to have trouble in the wider grouping anyway. So based on that alone, mine is going to be Oudinot at the top, Marmont, Grouchy, and Poniatowski.
Interesting. Interesting. Sam, what's your ranking?
I very much like Josh relied on the pictures a lot because as probably been very well demonstrated by my lack of contribution regularly for this heat, I didn't know much about any of them until now, and my piece of paper has scribbles and scribbles because throughout the entire episode, like as I heard the pitches, I put orders, and then as we talked, I changed it around. It's been scribbled out 3 times. I'm still not 100% convinced. I think it's this order, but I've gone with Oudinot. Then apologies again if I butcher this. Poniatowski, then Grouchy, then Marmont.
Oh, ouch. My poor favorite nephew of a marshal, poor Marmont. Well, and Grouchy, actually, they're both my sort of favorite nephews in their own way.
Marmont flitted between 2nd and 4th constantly. It was that big a drop.
And what's interesting is that my order was Josh's order. So I went Oudinot, Marmont, Grouchy, Poniatowski. So we're all kind of in agreement, because it will be a majority vote. I'm sorry, Sam, you've been overruled, and we're going to go back to what you originally at one stage had, which is Marmont in 2nd and Poniatowski in 4th place. So Oudinot unequivocally gets 5 points. Marmont controversially gets 4. Grouchy, bless him, gets 3, and Poniatowski, I'm very sorry, mate. I will come and pay my respects in due course. You get 2. But as you know, folks, that is only part of the story. If you head over to YouTube, you can, of course, vote by just typing in, not necessarily in all caps, who your favorite marshals. You don't need to shout it at me. I will hear you either way. And we will include those in our rankings of who comes out on top. You can also, if you're listening to this on Spotify, vote via Spotify itself. Just scroll down and you'll see a vote that enables you to do that. And last but by no means least, if you head over to Twitter, details in the show description, you will be able to take part in the public poll. We, of course, aren't quite done. We're going to need to consider who our wild cards might be. So we will do some more convening. But for now, a huge thank you to my very patient guests who have done approaching 6 hours of recording just to get these heats out to you, folks. So show them the love. Sam Jolly, curator at the Royal Logistic Corps Museum in Worthy Down, Winchester. Go visit. It's there's some Napoleonic stuff in there. You've got a very fetching goatee, and you've got a gravestone that you're currently got in storage. I don't know what you're going to do with it in due course. Do I need to edit that out? Is that an announcement that you?
That's fine. No, there's a gravestone recently acquired that was smashed in Croydon of John Kennedy, the quartermaster of the Royal Wagon Train. I think he died in about 1804. He was only quartermaster there for about a year when it was formed, but it's going to go in our little Waterloo section. But we also have Napoleon's bread oven captured by the Royal Artillery after the Battle of Waterloo.
And I will neither confirm nor deny whether at the end of the day, Sam spends a solid half hour kneeling in prayer beside Napoleon's bread oven. You also have Monty's Rolls Royce, don't you?
We do also have Monty's Rolls Royce, and I have driven Monty's Rolls Royce, and I have not crashed Monty's Rolls Royce, which I'm not a bad driver. That's not what I was trying to say there.
No,
If you've ever driven a classic car, you know they're a lot heavier. They don't, and I've got a little tiny Fiat 500, which drives very, very differently to a massive, very heavy Rolls Royce Wraith built in 1937 without power steering.
That's also worth saying, without power steering. So if you do see an antique Rolls Royce careering wildly across the roads of rural Hampshire, it's not necessarily Sam's fault, is all I'll say. So a huge thank you to Sam for your diligence and patience over the course of recording these. You will, of course, be back for the balloon debate, so I'm sure you can't wait to do another couple of hours of recording on that. And of course, a huge thank you to Josh Provan, who by this point is very used to me waffling on for endless hours at him. Author of Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira on the Maratha and Jat campaigns, and Every Hazard and Fatigue on the Siege of Pensacola. Folks, go to hellion.co.uk, type in the names of the books that I've just mentioned, and avail yourself. I don't know if there'll be a discount at the point of release, but hey, hopefully you got money for Christmas so you can afford them. And please do go direct to Hellion in order to support your author, because they get a standard percentage of what is sold. And if you can find the money to actually buy direct from the publisher, it basically means that the authors get a slightly bigger slice of a very meager cut, because there is not money to be made in writing history books unless you've got a very fancy or singing or dancing publisher. And also check out the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel, because you need to. Josh, Sam, huge thank you for your time throughout these. A massive thank you once again to the contributors for this heat and in all of the heats for a series of utterly spectacular pitches. You've heard Joe Ayres making the case for Oudinot, David Graylick fighting the cause of Poniatowski, Sam Moore fighting a valiant rearguard action on behalf of Grouchy, and Dave Watson defending the honour of the Ragusa Marshal Marmont. Thanks for listening, folks. This has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We shall return very soon. Folks, as the festive season approaches, consider whether you'd be willing to do any of these things to spread the Napoleonic cheer. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Then sign up to our newsletter by contacting us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get the regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a novel Christmas gift for the Napoleonicist in your life? Check out our merch via the link in the description in order to support our work while giving your loved ones something distinctive this winter. If you aren't in a position where you can dig into your pockets, then believe me, we totally get it. But that doesn't mean that you can't thank us for the episodes that you've enjoyed in a different way. All podcast platforms have ways for you to leave your reviews, so just spare us 2 minutes and leave a review wherever you listen to us. It makes a world of difference in boosting our international ranking and widening our reach. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and develop new exciting documentary channels. So if you want to be kept entertained on a daily basis when it comes to Napoleonic nerdery, prices start from just £2 a month. And you can, if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramus, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and the enigmatically named Zed. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.